I am ranking every Legend of Zelda game from worst to best, and coming in dead last is one of my least favorite video games of all time with Zelda's Adventure. For years, people have made fun of the CDI games, and I understand why, but of all three games that came out for it, somehow they saved the worst for last. Right off the bat, this does not look or feel like a Zelda game at all. It was developed by Philips, the same company that makes these cramp-free laxatives. You know, I'll take the cramping. It's like they took all of the Zelda charm out of this to make a generic fantasy game, all the while forgetting to make that game fun. The game begins with horrifying live-action cutscenes that have no business being in this game whatsoever. This old man makes me wildly uncomfortable, and once you're given the ability to play the game, it doesn't get much better, because this is top-down Zelda at its absolute worst. For combat, Zelda uses a wand, but without listening to the NPCs and cutscenes, you wouldn't know that because it works just like a sword. Man, I love this wand. Hey you, come here! But somehow the worst part about this game isn't the terrifying cutscenes, it's the level design and gameplay in general. For 90% of the game, the controls barely work, and the loading screens from one area to another take so long that I get scared the game has completely frozen. I will say the variety in enemies is pretty solid, but having a lot of options doesn't matter if none of them are good. Some enemies require a specific weapon to kill them, and you just have to remember what that is, and then you have to surf through the disgusting amount of weapons you're given and figure out which one you have to use. And if you want to make progress in the game, most of that is done by talking to NPCs who have literally never said anything helpful ever. It's like they intentionally speak in riddles. And unless you have a degree in 15th century English, you're not going to have a single idea what they're saying. And of all of the CDI games, this one is the worst, not because of the terrible gameplay and dialogue, but because it's a level of bad that can't even be made funny. Unlike the next game, The Faces of Evil. Now this isn't much better, but at least it can be kind of funny. Unlike Zelda's Adventure, which went for a more dark and gritty tone, this had a much more cartoonish art style, which was absolutely a choice. Back in the early days of YouTube, there was a trend called YouTube poop. I'm not making that up, that is a real thing. And The Faces of Evil was one of the most used assets for that type of video. Mostly because the cutscenes were very weird, because they were wildly over-animated in a very creepy way, but it was still better than the old guy who gives me nightmares. Compared to Zelda's Adventure, the gameplay is very different, opting to go for a 2D platformer instead of a top-down view, which as an idea, I kind of like. However, the gameplay was just as bad. Being a 2D platformer, it would be helpful if you knew where or where not to jump, or if the enemies and obstacles had any predictability whatsoever, but they don't because this game was made by Satan himself. Hey, even I'm not that mean. But of course, rounding out all of the CDI games is the Wand of Gamelon. Saying this is better than The Faces of Evil is kind of like saying a car crash is better than a plane crash. It's kind of true, but they're both still a tragedy. This time, the king and Link both get kidnapped, and it's up to Zelda to figure out where they went. So she goes on an adventure that is just as stiff and borderline unplayable as the last one. Of course, the cutscenes are just as bad as the last title, and I'm not sure if it's because I played all three of these back to back, but this is the one whose cutscenes made me laugh the most likely because I was feeling Stockholm Syndrome. The platforming is still really bad, there are too many enemies that are horribly designed, and every time I got into an encounter, it was more painful than fun. I would be lying if I said it was at all worth it to try and play these in the modern day. So unless you want to play the worst of the worst Zelda games, I would ignore these and pretend they don't exist, because that is what Nintendo themselves do as well. When are we getting the CDI games on Switch Online? Great question, but if you could just look right here. I will be the first one to say it, The Legend of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link does not hold up well. To be fair, this is the second game in the series, so what we now know as the standard Zelda formula didn't exist yet. And compared to the first title, this tested out a lot of new ideas, and most of them just didn't land. Whether it's your first or fifth playthrough, this game is annoyingly difficult, and not in a way that signals good game design, more so one that makes you want to punch a hole in your wall. The difficulty doesn't build up over time, it is really annoying right off the rip, and up until you complete Death Mountain, the game is just annoyingly hard. There is little to no explanation on where to go, so much so that I had to write routes on different pieces of paper and figure out where I was from those, and it got to a point where I had a harder time looking through my notes than I did actually playing the game. This was the first Zelda game to be mostly a side-scroller, and for better or for worse, at least that part works pretty well. It's just that the enemies and the gameplay loop itself is designed to make you want want to cry. They did a lot of new things here that make this feel like more of a traditional RPG, like adding an experience point system and an overworld map where you can encounter enemies. And though this would seem like a really cool idea, it was also executed really poorly. Enemies will just appear out of nowhere, and fighting them ranges from being incredibly easy to non-stop shenanigans. And overall, I can see why the Zelda franchise shifted back towards what they were doing originally and left most of the ideas they added here to be forgotten with time. The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes is a game I think gets a worse reputation than it deserves, but when you're being compared to other Zelda games, it is just not in the same league. This was made for the 3DS and was designed to be a co-op Zelda experience. And if you have the facilities to get the multiplayer to work, then that can be really fun. But the problem is, most people don't. And the workaround to play this by yourselves is just not fun at all. And it sucks because there are a lot of things about this that I genuinely like. The game takes place in the land of Hytopia, a world that is essentially Hyrule but is very focused on fashion. The princess here named Styla gets a present in the mail that traps her in this ugly bodysuit, and it is your job to figure out a way to get it off her. And to do so, you play as Link, and Link, and Link.
I do not like this.
Now compared to other top-down Zelda games, this is a more dumbed-down experience, mostly because they had to make a game that both worked for a single player and for multiplayer, something they have absolutely never done before. But in their efforts to make this a great multiplayer game, they forgot to make this at all fun for a single person. Most of the puzzles in the game require you to have all three links working in tandem, which means for a lot of puzzles you have to stop, pick up the other two links, and then figure out how to navigate from there, turning something that should be a fluid experience into an absolute chore. And after having done both a full playthrough with friends and one by myself, I can't think of a good reason for a single person to try and beat through this game. And it's a shame because there are a lot of things about this that make this a charming adventure, like all of the outfits that give Link different powers and make it fun to revisit levels. And I don't want to do that because going back and playing this by myself is a form of self-harm. I know this may be a hot take, but going back and playing the original Legend of Zelda is very hard to do. That is not to say that this game is not as iconic or important to the series as you think it is. It's just that in the modern day, this is hard to pick up and enjoy. This is the premier adventure game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, being a lot of people's first big world they ever got to explore. And for its time, it did it extremely well. It's just that I don't have enough notebooks to keep up with anything that's going on. The original Legend of Zelda is full of secrets, so much so that a lot of them you need the handbook or a guide to figure out, and if you don't have that, you are just gonna be confused. The story is as simple as Zelda can get. Zelda is kidnapped by Ganon, and it is your job to get her back by collecting the 8 pieces of the Triforce that are hidden around Hyrule. You explore the world until you find a dungeon, go inside, fight everything, and do that a few more times. And even for being as old as it is, the dungeons are pretty solid. Naturally, they're not as flushed out as they would be in later games, but there were none that I thought were especially bad. The main problem for me is that the overworld is just very confusing. Unless you're hand drawing a map while playing or looking at a guide, it is very easy to get lost because this came out on the NES, which meant they didn't have a lot of space to make any of the areas look all that unique. And if you're not using an instruction manual or a guide, then you're just kind of relying off the NPCs, who do give you hints, but they're in the form of 15th century haiku. I would rather draw the pictures. This is a game that I think everybody should play, but if you don't beat it, I don't think anyone is going to blame you. A lot of the game design choices have not aged super well, but to label this as anything other than iconic would just be wrong. I know it's probably a hot take to put the Legend of Zelda Picross over the Legend of Zelda on the NES, but I really like puzzle games, and this is a very good one. Nintendo used to pump these out, and of recent, they just haven't done that, and it makes me sad to my very core. But just like pretty much every Picross game ever, this has you doing math to solve puzzles. You use the numbers on the columns and rows to figure out what spaces you should and should not fill in, and the end result ends up being something that came from the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, a Zelda game that got a lot of weird spin-offs. Unlike Mario and Pokemon, the Legend of Zelda doesn't get a ton of weird spin-offs like this. And even though I am a big fan of Picross, I feel like it would be morally wrong to put this any higher on the list. That being said though, if Nintendo wants to make more of these, I would absolutely be down. And up next is the other spin-off based on Twilight Princess, Link's Crossbow Training. There has never been a better game to sell a piece of plastic that you will literally only use for 4 games. And though this is very gimmicky, it is also really fun. It is a very simple rail shooter, so don't expect anything that redefines the genre, but if you are a fan of Twilight Princess, then this has a ton of fan service. Every level takes place in a location that is familiar from the main game. And though the locations are nowhere near as deep as they were in the base game, it is still fun to see them in this new light. And blasting down a bunch of enemies using motion controls works really well. They did a fantastic job taking the set pieces from Twilight Princess and putting them in this world. And whether you're sailing down a river or shooting ski, none of it feels hard to play because of how simple it is. And though this was just a throwaway title to bundle in with the Wii Zapper, I still put more hours into this than I am willing to admit. And as a big fan of Twilight Princess, I feel like this is a game that more people should try. Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is a game I do enjoy, even though it has some issues. It is Dynasty Warriors meets Breath of the Wild, so it is cool to say the least. And the gameplay is exactly what you would expect, cutting through waves of hundreds of enemies as your favorite characters from Breath of the Wild. Unfortunately, they decided to make this a non-canon story, which by no means makes the story bad, but they were so close to giving us a prequel to one of the most popular Zelda games of all time, and then they just didn't. How do we make even more money off Breath of the Wild?
I have just the thing. We sell them this.
Wow, how did I not think of that? Outside of the flashbacks in Breath of the Wild, we don't really get a ton of information on what happened during this time. So it would have been great to get a real story that played out here, but what we got is still pretty good. I love the focus on Zelda and the champions and how much Breath of the Wild they shoved into every nook and cranny of this game. And everything from the battlefields to the UI looks like a one-to-one creation of the original game. And if you were someone like me who put a disgusting amount of time into the original, then this would almost be a must play. But gameplay wise, this struggles a lot. Compared to most of the Warriors games I've played, the frame rate is pretty low. And when you have so many things happening on screen at any given time, the drops get really noticeable. And I was really hoping this would get improved on the Switch too, but it didn't. So even when I revisited this recently, it was still hard to enjoy. And that's not to say this game is bad or unplayable, because it's not. Because even though frame rate drops don't usually bother me, in this case it does. And like any Warriors game, it does have the issue of getting pretty repetitive. But if you were someone who was looking for more Breath of the Wild, then this was a great thing to hold you over until we got Tears of the Kingdom. And even though it has issues, I still recommend playing it because this is Breath of the Wild fan service at its peak. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX is a fantastic Game Boy game. And going forward, if there are 2 games that are pretty similar, I'm going to combine them just for the sake of convenience. Link's Awakening DX is essentially a director's cut of the original Link's Awakening that also released on the Game Boy, but this time it released for the Game Boy Color. This was a real lateral move. That being said, it did make great use of the changes that the Game Boy Color allowed, like adding a full dungeon that was based off of Color.
It's a great day for the colorblind.
Link's Awakening was the first Legend of Zelda title that released for a handheld console, and they did a fantastic job replicating the home console top-down Zelda experience on the go, while making one of the most creative Zelda games I have ever seen. Link is on a boat that gets evaporated during a storm and is woken up on a new location known as Koholint Island, notable for having a pretty big egg on it. And the only way for Link to escape is to go around to the 8 dungeons on the island, collect all of the instruments of the sirens, and play the Ballad of the Windfish, who just so happens to be asleep inside of that really big egg. And though it's pretty short, the adventure you go on is both weird and really fun. The quests you go on for NPCs are pretty strange and whimsical compared to most other Zelda games, and there are a lot of Nintendo cameos here, especially with Mario characters. And this is really cool to see because Nintendo doesn't really do crossovers like this anymore unless they are very subtle. But there are chain chomps and Goombas on this island that Link will have to interact with pretty frequently. And though this is a Game Boy title, this holds up extremely well. However, there are some parts of this that got me pretty frustrated. The biggest thing is that you need to open and close your inventory a lot. Having all of these weapons and items the game requires you to use means you are going to be pausing and selecting items a lot. and that brings the pacing of dungeons and exploration to an absolute crawl. And though I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as I can, the ending of the story relies on a trope that really just does not sit well with me. If you have played this, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but overall, if you want to play this, it is very good, but I would play it in the most recent way, which we're going to talk about later. The first Hyrule Warriors has been released on a bunch of consoles, but the best version that you can play is absolutely on the Switch. Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition is a name that I don't really like, but to call it anything other than accurate is just wrong. And similar to Age of Calamity, this is fan service at its finest. You can play as pretty much every Zelda character that you have ever heard of, all the while cutting through hordes of enemies like they were not there at all. It is incredibly easy to pick up and play, and the gameplay loop is satisfying, though still a bit repetitive. Unlike Age of Calamity, there is less fan service towards a specific Zelda game as opposed to the entirety of the franchise that had released up until this point. So most of the sets you're in just look like a generic RPG location as opposed to something from Zelda, but you can also play as Linkle, so I think it kind of cancels out. Gameplay-wise, this feels a lot better than Age of Calamity, and though this is not something I would play for hours on end, in the short bursts I do play it, I still very much enjoy it. The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventure is a game I didn't think I was going to enjoy, but I very much did. And though it does a lot of things differently than every other Zelda title ever, it does all of these new things pretty well. Unlike Triforce Heroes, this was designed to be a multiplayer game, but it is still fun if you play by yourself. And though there's a lot of debate about the best Zelda game on the GameCube, I've never really heard anybody say this is it.
Twilight Princess is dark and mysterious. It is clearly the better game. First off, you're dumb, ugly, and wrong. Second off, Wind Waker is clearly better. I like Four Swords Adventure. Say it again and I will punch you to death.
Now, Four Swords Adventure is the worst selling Zelda game of all time, and I can kind of understand why, because this is not like any other Zelda game ever. Like a 2D platformer, this game is separated into different worlds, with the goal of being able to get to the end of a level as opposed to clearing a dungeon. And though it is very weird to see a Zelda game structured like this, it works really well. Of course, this is going to be a lot more fun if you can play it in multiplayer, but a lot of people didn't have all of the items required to do so, like 4 Game Boy Advance and the cables to connect them to the GameCube, so I can see why this didn't sell very well. But they did manage to make playing by yourself a ton of fun. Simultaneously controlling all 4 links works really well, and they did a very good job making it easy to manage all 4 characters without breaking a sweat. There are different formations you can use to control all the links at once, or if you need to, you can switch to just controlling one link, and that works too. Which makes me even more frustrated they were not able to do that in Triforce Heroes. And though they're never very popular, I would absolutely love it if Nintendo decided to make another multiplayer Zelda game. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually really enjoy The Legend of Zelda The Phantom Hourglass. And if this was about a year ago, I'm sure I would have put this far lower on the list, but after replaying it, though it definitely has its quirks, it is still a very good game. This was the first Zelda game that was made for the DS, so you know what that means. Yes, touch me.
I need an adult.
They had to make this a weird, gimmicky touch control game because why not? And to be fair, as a direct sequel to Wind Waker, this was a weird choice. The game begins with Link and Tetra setting sail on the high seas when out of nowhere a ghost ship appears and kidnaps Tetra, and Link, being the lovable klutz he is, ends up falling overboard, where he wakes up on an island. And you go on a pretty solid adventure to get Tetra back. It is the tried and true Zelda formula, but at least you're not rescuing Link from Ganon, so it makes it somewhat unique. Literally everything you do is done on the touchscreen. Whether you're attacking, moving around, or solving puzzles, your stylus will be in your hand more than it's not. And don't get me wrong, I would much prefer the ability to not have to play this way, because this can absolutely lead to some frustration. I don't think it's as horrible as a lot of people make it out to be. And as far as building a Zelda game off of this gimmick, it did a pretty good job. And I think it was a good choice to make the combat and puzzles a little more simple than they would be in other Zelda titles. That being said, this game absolutely has some problems. The Temple of the Ocean King is by far the worst Zelda location in the entire franchise. The puzzles and floors themselves are decently fine, but having to replay them over and over again because of bad game design drove me up a wall. You have to revisit this after almost every single dungeon. And it's not like they added checkpoints to make getting through this any easier, because for most of this game, whenever you go back, you have to beat through these same puzzles that you've already beaten through multiple times. And if that on its own wasn't already annoying, you have to do so while being sneaky and being timed. I get the name of the game is Phantom Hourglass, there was going to be some sort of time element, but I feel like this was the worst way they could have added it. And it's a shame because outside of this, I think there's a lot to love here. But I could see a lot of people getting really frustrated and not being able to finish this. The characters and locations you explore are pretty charming. There are a lot of unique segments that make great use of the DS's hardware, and you even get to ride on boats. It's not as fun as Wind Waker, but it's still pretty cool. And even though I've heard a lot of people say this game is terrible, including myself, I still think this is a solid portable Zelda experience that more people should give a chance. But if your main reservation about playing this is that you don't like boats and you would rather ride trains, then there is a game for you. Because The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks is just a little bit better than Phantom Hourglass. This takes place about 100 years after Phantom Hourglass. Can you tell? In this game, Link is working on becoming Princess Zelda's royal engineer. But things quickly fall apart when the evil Chancellor Cole destroys the Spirit Tracks and then swiftly proceeds to murder Zelda. There are way too many train puns to have this dark of a story. Now, Zelda's only kind of dead because she comes back as a ghost, who along your journey will help you out by possessing phantoms. And this is a pretty cool concept, which immediately makes this more fun than the last game. These phantoms make exploring dungeons a lot more fun. And similar to Phantom Hourglass, there is a location known as the Tower of Spirits that you will revisit multiple times, but this time they trimmed out a bunch of the annoying parts like having to rebeat multiple areas a few times and the strict time limit that make going back to this location feel a lot less like a chore. Oh yeah, and there's also trains. Now this is a bit of a lateral move from the boats, but I do enjoy it. When you travel from one area to another, you do so on a train. But for the most part, there is usually something going on to keep your attention. Whether you're being chased by an evil train or fighting off pirates, there is something going on to keep you engaged. And just like Phantom Hourglass, having the villain be someone like Chancellor Cole and not Ganon is a great change of pace. I mean, you can kind of tell this man is evil because he's wearing two hats. That's insane behavior. But they managed to do a very good job improving the things that Phantom Hourglass set up, while still retaining all of that DS gimmicky charm that they were going for. And I would love it if they found a way to remake these games without forcing you to use the touchscreen. The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages are two separate games. That being said, they are next to each other on this list, so I am going to be talking about both of them together, but up first is Oracle of Seasons. Similar to a Pokemon title, this was a split release that brought you on two very distinct adventures that had very similar gameplay elements. In Oracle of Seasons, using the power of the Triforce, Link is transported to the world of Holodrum. And once you're there, you meet the Oracle of Seasons named Din, who after a bit of partying gets kidnapped by a tornado and is being held captive by Onyx. And of course, because he's an upstanding citizen, Link decides to go get her back. The main gimmick in Oracle of Seasons is that Link has the ability to change the season.
Wow, who would have guessed?
And as a gimmick for a Zelda game, this is actually pretty cool. When you change the season, it allows Link to access parts of the world that he may not have been able to otherwise. For some reason, he has to jump on a stump to do it, something I really don't understand. But compared to a lot of other Zelda games, this was a great idea. Now, of the two games, this is the one that is supposed to have a larger focus on the combat. And I can see what they were going for, and they did a good job. But as a handheld Zelda for the Game Boy, I don't think anybody was picking this up for the revolutionary combat. There are some exclusive items in either of the games, with this one offering the magnet gloves, which allow you to fly around using the power of magnets, an idea that I think is pretty cool. And in both games, there are rideable mounts, the most important of which being Ricky the kangaroo. I would literally die for him, which is something that I did not expect to be in this game, but now that I've experienced it, why is this not in any other Zelda game? But between the two games, because this had more of a focus on combat, I don't think the puzzles are nearly as engaging, and though it's a good idea, the gimmick of changing seasons is not as cool as what we got in The Legend of Zelda The Oracle of Ages. Just like the last game, the Triforce transports Link to the world of Labrynna. There he meets the Oracle Nehru, who gets kidnapped by Varin, and of course, he goes on a quest to get her back. Now, being called the Oracle of Ages, this one has the gimmick where you travel in time, an idea that they absolutely have never done in a Zelda game. And though I still think that being able to change the season is pretty cool, being able to go back in time to talk to the ancestors of characters is such a great idea. This allows the characters to be more flushed out and interesting, something that this did a lot better than its sibling game. And while that would already put this over the top, this also has a much larger focus on good puzzles. And though some of the dungeons still suffer from some outdated game design similar to Link's Awakening DX, that can be forgiven because this game has a tree that wants to get with Link, really wants him to lay down that wood. Exploring both of these worlds was an absolute delight, and I don't think there are any Legend of Zelda games that deserve a modern remake more. And if you're willing to play through both of these games, you're able to put in passwords to get the true final boss fight, which is a really cool idea that encourages you to play both games. Again, trying to remain spoiler-free, I don't really love who the boss fight's against, but still, unlike other games that have a split release and only have a few differences, the amount of differences between these titles absolutely warrants playing through both. Because again, these are both two separate games. And though I'm certain this gimmick of a split release isn't coming back to a Zelda game anytime soon, it was a really good idea for the time. At its core, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask 3D has a lot of good things going for it, but it also changed a lot of things that I don't really love enough to separate it from the original game. And though this has a lot of changes that I'm not really a big fan of that make the experience overall worse, it's still The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, so it has one of the weirdest and darkest stories in the entire Zelda franchise. But this time it's available to play on the go. And it's just a shame that a lot of these changes ended up hurting the game more than helping. Now, to be fair, there are some really good changes. First off, I personally think the art style looks a lot better here. It does lose a little bit of the eeriness, but the game looks a lot more like the artwork that released alongside the original, something that I used to look at for hours because of how good the artwork was. So to have this game resemble that even more is something that I had always wanted. And the introduction of changes to the Bomber's Notebook and the Song of Double Time make the time management aspect of this game a lot more manageable. And if that were it, this would be an overall upgrade, but there were some other changes that make me want to shave my head and become a Buddhist monk. When Link is using the Deku Scrub mask, he just feels worse. He's slower and a bit more annoying to control, and considering you spend a big portion of the beginning of this game playing as him, it is very noticeable. But that is drops in the bucket compared to what they did massacring how it feels to play as Zora Link. For some reason, they decided to link fast swimming with the magic meter, a change that may seem like a good idea, but if you put any amount of critical thought into it, it is really stupid. They were attempting to make it easier for Link to navigate those tight areas, but they ended up making it so playing as Zora Link, the coolest transformation outside of the endgame, just feels like an absolute chore. Now, I could see if you were somebody who had never played this on the N64 not really minding this, but a lot of these changes ended up causing more problems than they solved. So even though there are parts of this I genuinely liked, it's hard to go back and justify playing this when I could just play it on the N64. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening remake on the Switch is absolutely the best way to experience this game. I can understand how a lot of people might not be a big fan of the art style they went for here, but I personally think it looks really good. And I think it matches how weird and out there this world is compared to any other Zelda game. Every single part that made Link's Awakening DX so fun is in this title, retaining all of the weirdly placed but awesome cameos that made this game so unique, while at the same time fixing this game's largest issue, which was how many times you have to navigate the menus in order to use items. Being on the Switch as opposed to the Game Boy meant that you had more buttons, and they did a fantastic job making the entire experience more intuitive than ever. And I knew this game was going to be worth revisiting from the very beginning with one of the coolest animated cutscenes I have ever seen in a Zelda title. And the only real complaint I have is that this also has frame rate drops for some reason. This is a Game Boy game, it's not like it's the most complicated thing in the world, but sometimes if you were in a dungeon or entering a new area, it would briefly stop running well. Not enough where it would be frustrating, but enough to make you question why that is happening in the first place. But even with this minor issue, if you want to play through Link's Awakening, this is the best way to do it. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, for better or for worse, is the definition of a Wii game. As soon as the Wii was announced, I knew that eventually we were going to get a Zelda game that had you swiping your way through the action. And this plays exactly like you think it would.
Hey, I think you should take a break. What are you talking about? It's only been 6 minutes.
As a concept, this is a very cool idea, but I can see it being a little bit off-putting for a lot of people. Needing to use motion controls for every aspect of this game can get pretty tiring, especially if you want to beat the entire game. And as someone who likes to sit down and play for hours on end, this this got pretty stale very quickly. But even though it can get a little monotonous, when it does work, it works really well. Having to time an attack or swipe the right direction to fight an enemy feels good. And when you hit a good rhythm, more so than any other Zelda game, you feel like you are directly in the action. And though it's similar to how Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks overly relied on a gimmick, I think they executed the motion control very well, even though there should have been the option to play in another way. And the main problem here is that the game was just not paced very well. This game takes so long to get going. There is about 1 to 3 hours of tutorial and story before you can get into the actual gameplay. And though the story ends up being really good, it should not be this slow. But when the game actually gets going, it has some incredible gameplay and dungeons that really make up for how slow of a start it has. The new gimmicks for all of the dungeons work so well. And without getting too into it, there are some incredible dungeons like the Sky Keep, the Ancient Cistern, and the Sand Ship that all have incredible puzzles that were so much fun to explore. And though I can absolutely see why this is one of the most divisive Zelda games ever made, for those who are willing to get through it and deal with all of Fi's nonsense, there was so much to love. And it was even better when you played through Skyward Sword HD. I was debating whether or not to include these together, but considering how much more accessible this is, I felt like it deserved its own spot. Because for a while, I think most people thought that Skyward Sword was forever going to be stuck on the Wii, because even though the Switch had motion controls, it didn't really make sense to bring it over. But I'm willing to put on my idiot hat and admit that I was wrong. This finally gave players the ability to play this in handheld and using a controller. And though it's far from a perfect fix, it is still a much better experience. Because if I want to keep playing the game but don't want to pass out, I can do that. And though using the right stick to mirror motion controls doesn't work perfectly, it is that freedom and flexibility alone that makes this a much more engaging experience. And they also made this run at a smooth 60 frames per second, while simultaneously making Fi appear far less often. Thank God. And though it's not technically part of the game, they also had the coolest Joy-Cons release alongside this that I absolutely love. But even without that, this is absolutely the best way to experience Skyward Sword. Thankfully, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom released was good and finally made a Zelda game that you play as Zelda that is not on the Philips CDI. And though this is very different than any other top-down Zelda game, it somehow managed to capture the formula incredibly well. This borrows the art style from the Link's Awakening remake, which for some people could be devastating news, but for me, I genuinely enjoy it. And for the most part, Zelda's moveset is completely different. Now, she does have the ability to mirror what Link can do, which is pretty cool, but for most of the problems you have, you're gonna solve it by summoning an Echo. This can be a creature, a box, a bed, or literally anything that you see on your journey. And though I didn't think I was going to like this at first, it is done very well. Now, the biggest issue is that navigating this menu to figure out what you're gonna summon is about as fun as going to the dentist, because there are so many options and not really a good way to sort through them. But outside of that glaring oversight, this makes the gameplay loop feel more engaging without getting rid of the charm that makes the series so beloved in the first place. There's something so weird but satisfying seeing a creature that you defeated now fight on your side. And though I wish they went a little bit further with this idea, having more puzzles that required specific echoes to solve them, the freedom that they give you to solve problems however you see fit is really nice to see. This was the first Zelda game in a very long time to bring back new traditional dungeons. And though they are pretty easy, they handled them very well. And for the first time in a very long time, you can warp inside a dungeon, getting you back to wherever you need to go, which is something that I loved so much because they almost completely removed the need to backtrack at all. And also, you can make smoothies. I don't know who asked for this, but I'm glad they did. And though this is a very different experience than any other Zelda game that we've ever gotten, I would absolutely love another game that uses this concept and takes it even further. Or even just more Zelda games that you get to play as Zelda.
Come on, how am I supposed to solve this?
Now, have you tried placing down 11 beds?
Dang, I should have thought of that.
The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess released for the GameCube and Wii at right around the same time. And though most people originally played this on the Wii, both versions are absolutely incredible. After Wind Waker released to a collective,
"What the heck is this?"
people were anxiously anticipating Zelda's return to a more realistic art style. And Twilight Princess did just that. And though these versions don't hold up as well as Wind Waker does after all these years, I can't sit here and say that these games look bad. This is one of the longest traditional Zelda games in the entire series, because you could easily drop between 50 and 60 hours getting through everything this game has to offer. But just like Skyward Sword, a good 2 to 3 hours could have been cut out of the very beginning because this takes such a long time to get going. Even if they just cut down the first hour, it would have made the entire game so much more digestible. And though this isn't the biggest problem when you're comparing it to other Zelda games which get into the action much faster, it is something that makes revisiting the game pretty hard to do. The main gimmick here is that you play as both Link and Wolf Link, an idea that caused me both genuine confusion and horror as a child, but is executed so well that I am willing to repress the nightmares. When you play as Wolf Link, you're a lot faster, though it comes at the cost of having a lot of options, and though you can only use him in very specific areas, it was a great way to break up the gameplay and add something new that no other Zelda game has really tried. And though the speed of Wolf Link makes regular Link feel pretty slow by comparison, the amount of options you're given with items and creative puzzles you get to solve more than make up for it. The dungeons here, like most 3D Zelda games, are absolutely phenomenal. The city in the sky, the Snow Peak ruins, and the Arbiter's grounds are so cool, and it makes getting through the long tutorial so worth it. And though there were a ton of things I absolutely loved, there was also a couple things I really didn't, which again, trying to remain spoiler free, all have to do with how the story plays out, but Twilight Princess on the GameCube and Wii is still a very good time. But like I said with some other games, it's hard to go back and play these when a better version exists. But if this is the only way you have to play it, it is still absolutely worth your time. The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap is one of my favorite handheld Zeldas of all time, having one of the most unique art styles in a pocket-sized adventure that is so much fun. The art style alone is one of my favorite in the entire series. The sprites and world you explore look so alive. And this is even more well done when you take into consideration this game's gimmick being able to shrink down to a microscopic size. And they did an excellent job really making Link feel a lot smaller, because it's not just used in dungeons, there are full areas you get to explore alongside it. And though it's not the most flushed out gimmick, they did a really good job making this a short but sweet adventure. Vaati kidnaps Zelda and you are immediately thrust directly into the action. There's not a lot of fluff or extra padding to fill out the game's playtime. But this is a top-down Zelda game if they boiled it down to its absolute core. It has really good dungeons with unique items that make them stand out from any other Zelda game, while still being the perfect amount of complex that takes some critical thinking without making you want to rip your hair out. And the only thing I wanted from this game was just a little bit more. And though I don't necessarily wish they added more content, I do wish they played around more with the gimmicks to make this already great adventure even more memorable. And while we're at it, I didn't really love the idea of having to collect and put together all of these kinstone. As a concept, I get what they were going for, but this ends up feeling a lot more tedious than fun. But those are just very small critiques on an overall very solid package. And though after my first playthrough I did wish there was more to do, I think this is a very solidly paced Zelda experience, and it is the perfect game to give someone if they have never played a top-down Zelda before. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker on the GameCube was one of the first Zelda games I ever beat from start to finish. And this game holds a special place in my heart because it is such a unique experience. They took the idea of exploration in a Zelda game to new heights, allowing you to set sail in a flooded version of Hyrule that feels more open and vast than anything in the series' history. And though, to be fair, a lot of the ocean is just water, there was something about sailing from one island to another with complete freedom that had me completely captivated. I distinctly remember when this first released, a lot of people were very upset about the art style. And by that I mean my brother was very upset about the art style, but I was a kid, so I didn't care because I thought it looked really cool. And playing this today feels exactly as good as this looks. Link is fast and fluid and never feels like he is slugging around. No matter what you're fighting, you always feel like you are directly in the action. And they easily could have changed the gameplay as much as they changed the art style, but thankfully they didn't. And they just refined what made Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask so fantastic. As a child, I distinctly remember just sailing from one island to another, seeing what secrets I could uncover in each of these areas, and then quickly exploring onto the next. And it didn't matter how many times I would go to an island, whenever I would revisit it, I would always find something new. To be fair, this is most likely because I was a child, but that sense of wonder never really faded. Now, compared to some other games, the variety in dungeons is a little bit lackluster, with most of the available dungeons being pretty small when compared to other games in the series, but with locations like the Forsaken Forest, the Earth Temple, and the Tower of the Gods being in this, I didn't really care about the length, because they were all so good. Yes, even the Tower of the Gods was good, even though there was a lot of waiting for the water, but when you take it all into consideration with the music, the boss fights, and the overall scale of this world, then this version of The Wind Waker still holds up incredibly well. And now that it's on Nintendo Switch Online for the Switch 2, more people have the ability to play it than ever before. and I'm glad because I want more people to experience this even if it's not the best way to do so. Now at this point there's only a couple of games left. And that being said, up next is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past.
What are you doing? Just starting a small fire.
In no way do I think A Link to the Past is a bad game. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who would put this as number one. And though I think it's great with all of the games that make up this series, there were some tough calls that had to be made. As the third game in the Zelda series, this is what set the standard going forward. The way they handled the dungeons and the progression was almost perfect, with the first 2/3 of the game being pretty straightforward and having great design with their dungeons, and though it struggled a bit with being a little bit too cryptic like the earlier titles at the end, I still think overall dungeon-wise, this had a great selection. And for its time, the size of this world with everything there is to do in it was absolutely insane. Because not only was there the original version of Hyrule, there was also the Dark World, which was more or less the same thing, but was also so much fun to explore. And what makes exploring even better was how many great items there were at your disposal. Whether it was the bombs or the hookshot, there was always something new to uncover. And being able to experiment with everything they gave you was so rewarding. Now, because this was the first Zelda game that nailed the formula, there were other things that were changed in games down the line that were a bit of an improvement, like how the swordplay and combat feels a little bit more flushed out in games like the Minish Cap. Which is not to say it feels bad here at all, it just feels a little bit more dated. And though this was iconic on the Super Nintendo, when I go to replay this, I go for the version that released on the Game Boy Advance. Now aesthetically, this is almost a one-to-one remake with just a little bit of visual improvement here and there. But the thing that I like about this the most is not the Four Swords adventure, which is pretty cool, it's that this is far more forgiving, with more consistent and better options for saving if you happen to die. And as much as I would love to talk about Four Swords, I have never really gotten to play it, so all I can say is that it looks pretty cool, but it is also the reason that we eventually got Triforce Heroes, so it's kind of a blessing and a curse. But needless to say, A Link to the Past is a fan favorite and a cult classic for a reason. And if you're a Zelda fan who has not played this, then I think you deserve a life sentence in jail. And up next, with arguably just as divisive of a ranking, is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Now this is looked at as one of, if not the greatest video game ever made. And I understand that from the perspective of how iconic this video game truly is, going on to impact how all 3D games would be and still are made to this day. Just like how A Link to the Past perfected the formula for top-down, Ocarina is what perfected it for 3D Zeldas, being the first and therefore setting the standard for every game to come. And getting to experience Link's journey as he goes from a kid without a fairy to the hero of time is something that everybody should do at least once in their life. But though this set the standard for every game going forward, there are things that other games did better that I ended up liking more. Now, unlike Majora's Mask, which has some very big and noticeable differences between the 3DS and the original version, I think that you can play this game on either console and have a fantastic time. And the only reason this isn't higher on the list is because it is a very simple Zelda game, which compared to some other games, that is a very good problem to have. But because they spent most of their effort on making a 3D game that worked at all, they couldn't really experiment as much as they would with games going forward. Which does make this the most accessible 3D Zelda game for anyone to pick up and play, but also makes it so this is a very cut and dry Zelda adventure. Now, being able to travel in time and play as both young Link and adult Link is a very cool concept, because there are things that adult Link can do that young Link can't, and vice versa. And this plays in perfectly to how dungeons are going to be structured depending on what character you're playing as. And though there are some less than perfect dungeons here, with the Water Temple being the most iconic example, a dungeon that I will say I think is very overhated, the entire experience is Zelda in its truest form, which all wraps up with one of the most iconic boss fights in video game history. So even though I'm not putting this at the #1 spot, I would like to go on record and say this is a must-play game. And if you are getting into The Legend of Zelda for the first time, this is one of the only games I recommend starting with. And of the 2 versions that currently exist, I don't think there is a bad way to play it.
No, you're a fraud. It's okay, I hear you. Let it out. Don't be nice to me. I'm trying to make you upset.
The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom was a game that I was so excited for, I went out and bought an additional Nintendo Switch. And though I don't think it's perfect, I still think it's a fantastic time. Now, this is a sequel to Breath of the Wild, a game that would go on to completely revolutionize how we would see 3D Zelda going forward, and though this had a lot more options that allowed you to be more creative, I also think that that kind of took away from the overall experience that Breath of the Wild set up. Tears of the Kingdom plays just like Breath of the Wild if you had a lot more creative control. They replaced the Sheikah Slate by giving Link a completely new arm. And with the new arm came a host of new abilities, like the ability to construct pretty much anything your mind can conceive. And as an idea, I feel like that was really cool and a perfect way to make a sequel that feels different than the original. Because even though this shares a lot of the same mechanics as Breath of the Wild, it also feels completely different. And they also went ahead and added a bunch of new locations like the Depths, which horrifies me to this day, and the Sky Islands, which are pretty cool even though they are a bit more limited. So with all of this new stuff, you would think that this would naturally be a better game. And in a lot of ways, you're right. The problem is, it also removed a lot of what I thought made Breath of the Wild such a good game. Now, when we get to Breath of the Wild, I'll go into more detail about what I like about that game, but by having so many options with Tears of the Kingdom, like being able to create a construct that kills whatever you want, having an army of allies that you can summon at a moment's notice, or the ability to fuse two weapons together to do a ton of damage, makes it so you never really have to worry at any given moment about what's going on around you. Which isn't to say that this game is far too easy, because there are sections that are pretty difficult, but I feel like a lot of the things that were added or changed were more so done to feel different as opposed to feel like an improvement. That being said, I have put so many hours into Tears of the Kingdom that it is frankly disgusting. There is something so satisfying about flying around on a hover cart in a Zelda game that doesn't make a lot of sense, but is still so much fun. And though a lot of people think the newer open world Zelda games are a disgrace to what made Zelda so iconic in the first place, I am personally someone who welcomes this change. And though that doesn't mean I want them to stop making traditional 3D Zelda games in the way they used to, it does mean I would love to see more 3D Zelda games that take this idea and run with it even further. And it doesn't matter if you play Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild, you are going to have a fantastic time. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess HD took everything that I already loved about Twilight Princess and made it even better. The upscaled art style looks fantastic, and though I still find it to be a little too gritty and dark for my personal taste, to say this looks anything other than good is a bold-faced lie. But outside of having better visuals, all of the changes that came along with being on the Wii U made this so much easier to revisit. With the gamepad being a second screen, it means that you can switch items so much faster. They expanded the size of the wallet so you can carry more rupees. The gamepad also made it way easier to transform into Wolf Link, and even the ability to use gyro aiming on the gamepad. And though there were some changes that I didn't really like all of the additions for Miiverse, a service that no longer works, and the fact that they made Epona really annoying to use. But outside of those, the rest of the changes make it so this is the premier way to play Twilight Princess. And though a lot of the problems with the pacing, especially in the early game, are still prevalent, if you are one of the 5 people who own a Wii U and are proud enough to admit it, Twilight Princess HD is a game I consider a must-play on that console. A Link Between Worlds is a game I never thought we were going to get, but boy, I am glad we did. Because this took everything I loved about A Link to the Past and made it even better, giving you more freedom, more complex dungeons, and the best gameplay that we have ever gotten in a top-down Zelda game. Oh, and Link can become graffiti on a wall. I tried to do this myself and it did not work. The gameplay is fast and responsive, and the fact that Link can move in a 360-degree circle feels incredible. And especially having come out after Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, having actual button presses feels so nice. You really don't know what you have until it's gone. Since this is a sequel to A Link to the Past, there are a lot of set pieces that are pretty much exactly the same, with one big glaring difference being that this time you don't explore the Dark World, you explore Lorule. This is the peak of Zelda puns, and I will hear no arguments. The story here is pretty interesting too. The evil sorcerer Yuga kidnapped Princess Zelda and all of the sages and turned them into paintings. A weird but cool power that affects everybody but Link because he is wearing a fancy bracelet that now gives him the ability to latch onto walls whenever he sees fit. And though this gimmick is simple, it makes a world of difference. This alone makes a lot of the dungeon's puzzles even more engaging, because this idea is used a lot. Whether you're getting to an area that looks like you wouldn't be able to get there otherwise, or using it to quickly avoid getting knocked off a platform, at no point when using it was this gimmick anything but fun. Another big change is that you can do the dungeons in pretty much any order you want. Instead of the typical Zelda formula where you go to a dungeon, get an item, and then use that for the rest of your game, you can just go to your house and rent whatever item you want from Ravio. I thought this was nabbit for an embarrassingly long time. Being able to rent whatever items you want whenever you want them is a great idea, and though you lose them when you die, you do have the ability to buy them whenever you want. It's expensive, but you can do it. And all of these changes came together to make the most interesting top-down Zelda game of all time. And considering how good the series has always been, that is an accolade that is the highest possible honor. And this, alongside Ocarina of Time 3D and all of the Virtual Console games, easily made the 3DS one of the best Zelda consoles of all time.
Now remember, we don't talk about Majora's Mask 3D, we only play
Majora's Mask on the Nintendo 64. Now this could completely be a nostalgia bias because I hear that a lot of people don't really like this game, but I think they are insane because this game is so much fun. Unlike every other Zelda game that has you fighting some big bad enemy, this time you're fighting a mask. It's an evil mask, if that makes it any better. The Majora's Mask has taken over Skull Kid, who right at the beginning of the game robs Link for his Ocarina of Time and lures him to the interesting yet evil world of Termina, which is 3 days out from a cataclysmic event where the moon with a terrible face is falling towards the earth. And as a final little jab, the Skull Kid turns Link into a Deku Scrub and leaves him to perish. And it is now Link's job to figure out how he is going to turn back and also prevent the entire world from ending. Now the central mechanic of this game is reliving the same 3 days over and over again. And as somebody who's a fan of Pikmin, I've never really been bothered by the whole time management in games thing. And during this repeating 3-day cycle, you have to go find the 4 giants hidden around the land of Termina, so you can enlist their help to prevent the moon from crashing into the world. The dungeon selection is solid throughout the entire game, but the dungeons aren't really the thing that makes Majora's Mask a great game. It's learning how Termina works like the back of your hand and helping save all of the people who are in this world. When you repeat the same 3 days over and over, you get to learn these characters' schedules really well. And the biggest part of this game is going and helping all of the characters in Termina and getting to know them even better. By doing so, you get access to new quests and new masks, which is another thing that I absolutely adore about this game. There are a bunch of masks with a variety of different effects. Of course, there's the Deku Scrub mask, which turns you into a Deku Scrub, the Zora mask that actually feels really good here, and the Goron mask, which I also really like. And being able to use these forms and play as different races from the Zelda world is such a cool idea, and I really wish they would do another game that used this concept. And though this doesn't have the typical Zelda story where you fight Ganon and save Zelda, it is still one of the best adventures that Link has ever embarked on. And though I think you should play Ocarina of Time first, I think this is the better overall game. But even slightly better is The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker HD. Now this took everything that made the original Wind Waker so great and made it even better, adding a ton of quality of life changes that make this hands down the best way to experience this adventure. If this didn't exist, I could see the original Wind Waker being higher on the list, but considering how subtle yet great these quality of life changes are, there is almost no reason to go back and play that since this exists. Just like with Twilight Princess, the gamepad support alone makes this a much more fluid experience. Having the second screen that displays the map and all of your items is so nice to have, and the addition of the Swift Sail makes exploring the world and sailing around even more fun. The sense of speed and freedom that this gives you is something that I can only describe as magical, because there are times in the modern day that I will turn this on just to sail around. And if that alone doesn't describe how great this game is, I don't think anything will. Everything about this game looks more polished and refined with the new HD features, and they streamlined one of the endgame quests so much that it makes going back and playing this on the GameCube really hard to do. In my opinion, the Wind Waker HD is the best mainline traditional Zelda game that we have ever gotten, and I would love for them to do something in this timeline that isn't the Phantom Hourglass or Spirit Tracks. But if they wanted to do that and still include trains, I would be fine with that. And though I moved this game around a lot, the best Legend of Zelda game of all time is The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Now I understand for a lot of people, especially people like me who grew up with the traditional games, this was a bit of a culture shock. But Breath of the Wild feels like a more realized version of what the original Legend of Zelda was trying to be, being an open world adventure game where you can do whatever you want, whenever you want to do it. Because Breath of the Wild is freedom in video game form. And though, like every other Legend of Zelda game, it is not perfect, it is a game that you can drop hundreds of hours into without even realizing that it's happened. From the very moment that you leave the Great Plateau, you are given all of the tools you need to beat the game. And if you wanted to, you could go do it that very instant. But exploring the world of Hyrule is where all of the fun is to be had. And I know the most common complaints is that Hyrule feels empty and that the weapon durability system is really frustrating, and though I totally understand if that's something that bothers you, for me those are two things that makes this entire experience all the more memorable. Hyrule in this game is a world that has been devastated by 100 years of cataclysm. Calamity Ganon has taken over the world, took on all of its heroes, and won. And what is left are the remnants of his carnage that have destroyed the land. So I'm not really shocked shocked this world isn't full of happy people, and though I think they absolutely could have added more, if you're looking around, there is always something near you that you can do, whether it's fighting an enemy, collecting a Korok seed, or completing a shrine. Now, outside of the Divine Beasts, which are this game's equivalent of a temple, the main dungeons have been replaced with 120 separate shrines. I don't know what Nintendo's fascination with the number 120 is all about, but it does make it pretty easy to keep track of how many more you have to go. There are a bunch of different types of shrines, and you never really know what you're gonna get, which is part of what makes this game so much fun to explore. I'll be wandering to an area to go complete a quest, and on the way I'll see a shrine and get distracted and go do that, and once I'm done with that I'll go see some enemies, so I'll go fight them, and along the way I'm switching out weapons because all of them keep breaking, which makes it so I have to be on my toes and always looking for another option of what to do. The weapon durability system is something that a lot of people don't seem to love, and as much as there are times where I absolutely agree because a weapon that I love breaks when I want to keep using it, it also makes it so you as a player have to make sure that you are always prepared for whatever situation you're getting yourself into, making even the smallest encounters even more suspenseful because the only tools that you consistently have are the ones on your Sheikah slate, which does have a bunch of cool abilities that replace the typical Zelda items that you can also use however you want. Breath of the Wild is a once-in-a-generation game, and though it had an official sequel with Tears of the Kingdom that in a lot of ways is better, Breath of the Wild is still one of the greatest video games of all time. And though at first I was going to put this a little bit lower on the list because it doesn't feel like a traditional Zelda, after playing every single Zelda game ever made, I don't think it's fair to dock this points because it dared to do something different.
Excuse me, you forgot to play all of the Tingle games? They are not real. It says right here they were released in Japan. You can't make me play them.